Many of you have heard me speak on other occasions, so I'm going to try to put a different twist to this. Let me just start off. Even though I'm a state university employee, I do not speak on behalf of my university or the state of Florida. I have to make that disclaimer. I'm not going to tell you why, but I have to make that disclaimer. My talk this morning is somewhat about the Confederate Constitution and the rule of law. And it's important to realize that we need to understand the terminology, the words that we're using, because as Thucydides pointed out many years ago, whoever controls the language controls the politics. And even though we may be speaking the same vernacular, we may actually be speaking cross purposes because the words mean different things to the speaker and the hearer. So I'm going to try to give you an idea as a political scientist. I'm not a historian, I'm a political scientist, and I sort of look at trends and trends analysis, where we've been, where we are, and where we're heading. Somebody made a comment a few minutes ago about this tie. To give you an example, it has the Confederate symbol, the flag on it. My wife bought this tie for me from a fundraiser from public television in the 90s. Could you imagine them selling a tie like this today? That's how quickly things change. And they do change quite a bit. But people with our sort of principles, our worldview, we're under assault. And whenever you're dealing with an enemy combatant or an opposing force, the first responsibility is to survive, then recover, and then retaliate. We're sort of in the survival mode. And let me give you an idea of what I'm talking about. I did have a PowerPoint, but I was ill prepared, didn't bring a flash drive. So I'm just going to read this to you. We all know that there's been a war against the South, the Confederacy, Confederate symbols. And when I say whoever controls the language controls the politics, let me give you an example. The word racist is very pejorative. We kind of shy away from it. But I'm here to tell you that what the word race means in the 19th century was closer to the meaning of the word ethnicity. And moreover, in a free society, I am free to be an ethnicist or a racist. That's a moral, ethical problem. It's not the business of government. Government officials are not so privileged because they supposedly represent the people. But when somebody calls me a racist, and I have been called that on a national scale, so what? What business is it of yours if I am, which I'm not, but I really am when I think about it, because we're all tribal by nature. For example, I'm from West Virginians. I like West Virginians. I don't necessarily like New Yorkers. I'm a cyclist. I like cyclists. I don't necessarily like couch potatoes. I have more in common with a minority, whatever stripe, color, region, cyclist than I do with a guy that looks like me that isn't a cyclist. So if somebody calls you a racist, ask them to explain what the heck they mean. And secondly, is it any of their business? If you are, like I said, that's a ethical, moral issue. It's not one necessarily for public discourse and for the government to tell us what we should and should not think. Let me give you an example. And I was going to project this on the PowerPoint. But this is how far we're down the rabbit hole. This is in a New York City school district. And they're teaching the kids in an elementary school the 8 white identities. And the 8 white identities, I'm not going to go through all the details, but this is what they're teaching young kids. So first they went after the Confederacy, now they're after the founding, and now they're after us, individuals. Not only to hate the South, the Confederacy, but to hate themselves. There's so much going on here, I don't have time to go into it. But these are the white identities. White supremacist, clearly marked by white society that preserves names and values white superiority. White voyeurism, wouldn't challenge a white supremacist. Desires non-whiteness because it's interesting, pleasurable, seeks to control the consumption and appropriation of non-whiteness. Fascination with culture, for example, consuming black culture without the burden of blackness. I know this is a bunch of nonsense, but I'm just telling you what they're teaching them. White privilege may critique supremacy, but a deep investment in questions of fairness, equality, under the normalization of whiteness and the white role, sworn goal of diversity. White benefit, sympathetic to a set of issues, but only privately. White confessional, some exposure of whiteness takes place, but as a way of being accountable to people of color. White critical, you see, as you go down from 1 to 8, you're being a better white. White critical, take on board critiques of whiteness and invest in exposing, marking the white regime. White traitor, actively refuses complicity, names what's going on. Intention is to subvert white authority and to tell the truth at whatever cost. Need them to dismantle institutions. White abolitionist, changing institutions, dismantling whiteness, and not allowing whiteness to reassert itself. Do you see the concentration camps out in the distance? This is serious. And if you look what's happening in South Africa, it's not what you think. Zuma was put in prison because of the corruption of the ruling class. Rightfully so, and I'm talking about the rule of law here. It was the South Africans regrouping and saying, stop this corruption. Not only people from South Africa, but people from India. They were robbing the country blind, destroying the middle class, creating a bipolar society of super rich and super poor. So Zuma was arrested, put in prison, and you now see the burning of South Africa. And why is South Africa burning? Because the power elite triggered it to burn. Because they want to present an image that the rule of law doesn't matter, and they want to regroup their control over the country. So what's happening there is what's happening in our cities. We are being duped, controlled. And I'm not going to go into the dynamics of it and the power structure and who's pulling the strings and so on and so forth. But this, what they're teaching in the schools, not only to hate your country, but to hate yourself. Everything Barbara was talking about is out the window with what they're teaching in New York City. We're in serious trouble. And so my talk, the Confederate Constitution and the rule of law is supposed to protect fundamental rights in the American political order. Life, liberty, and property. And that is a system that facilitates that. It's known as free markets, or you could use the Marxian term, capitalism. They're not only after individual freedom and dignity, they're after a free society. So when we think about the rule of law, it could be used for good, or it could be used against those fundamental rights and principles. So what's a constitution? We have the U.S. Constitution, which there are two. The one of 1789 is the second U.S. Constitution because we had the Articles of Confederation. We have the Confederate States of America Constitution. But the word Constitution is sort of a neon sign saying government's bad and potentially a threat to the fundamental rights. In all countries, whether it's the U.S. or the Confederacy, are subject to what we call the fatal sequence. And the fatal sequence is subject to corruption. So when the Confederate Constitution was drafted and ratified, it was trying to fix some of the inherent flaws of the U.S. Constitution. And I'm not going to enumerate what those fixes are, but it did do some very substantial things to try to control government to a greater extent than did the U.S. Constitution. But it wasn't by any stretch of the imagination a perfect document, because you're dealing with, once again, a constitution to limit government. So let's ask ourselves, what is government? Government's an abstraction. Government is essentially a group of individuals like you and me that are in a position of authority to exercise coercive force over us. And the Constitution is designed to limit that within a framework of protecting fundamental rights against aggression. So, in what manner and to what extent was the Confederacy a just system of governing? Now, this is very difficult to nail down factually. Much of this is speculation. Because to answer that question, first of all, we can't focus on slavery. That's ridiculous and nonsensical. But more importantly, the circumstances under which the Confederacy was launched is not inconsequential. To disregard those circumstances would be like judging the quality of a chef's cooking while the kitchen is ablaze and eventually burns to the ground prior to the presentation of the intended prepared meal. The best that could be done is to access the chef's cookbook and speculate. Confederate Case Law is an important chapter in the Confederate legacy. So we could look at what the courts were doing during the short period in which the Confederacy survived in trying to promote justice, protect individual rights. The Congress, we could look at that too, but they were fighting a war. Whereas the judges in the state courts, specifically the state Supreme Courts, had a certain commitment to fundamental rights. And it does give us some important insights. So with the case, with governments in general, the Confederacy had its defects. One such defect is in the government's DNA. Government by nature, as Thomas Paine said, and others, is a necessary evil. Why? Because human beings are flawed. And we live in a society, and we interact with each other. So if government's an abstraction, society's also an abstraction. Because if I told you to point to society, where would you point? To a certain geographical area? To a community? Society is made up of individuals. It all comes down to the individual. And this flaw of government can't be eliminated, but only mitigated. It is essential to realize that government is, and this is Murray Rothbard writing, government is that organization in society which attempts to maintain a monopoly of the use of force and violence in a given territorial area. It is the only organization in society that obtains its revenue by coercion. By coercion. As Machiavelli pointed out, the essence of politics is power, and the essence of power is violence. If bad people in politics have too much power, violence is in your future. Bastiat makes this quite clear in his great little pamphlet, The Law. It's all about plunder. Plunder. And a constitution is designed to mitigate against excessive plunder, both in the U.S., the Confederacy, in the states. So I'm going to skip over that. Now, this is important because I can't tell you how many people are ashamed of their Confederate ancestry. And, the allegations that the Confederacy was hostile to fundamental rights across the board, not only against, quote, slaves, but also against whites. The Confederacy was bad to the core. And that's another, word we need to come to an understanding. What is a slave? As I read through these pages and pages of case law, the slave is when somebody else owns the product, the production of your labor. They do not own the person.
Thank you.
In case after case, the courts have said the slave is a human, sentient being with fundamental rights. And I have so much evidence of where cases, I'll talk about one tomorrow, Josephine is an interesting case out of Mississippi, where on a technicality in the indictment, somebody obviously guilty of homicide, i.e. Josephine, a slave, her conviction was overturned in the state Supreme Court on a flawed indictment. But now this is if the Confederacy was hostile to fundamental rights, then the Confederate experience was both anathema to the principles of 1776 and justifiably crushed, in my view. However, if inaccurate, then when the Confederacy was defeated, so too were the principles of 1776, most immediately for the people in the Confederacy, but ultimately for those living today desiring to honor why they fought. By so honoring, resistance to emerging, well-disguised tyrannies are much more easily surmounted. In other words, I've been thinking about, what's happening in the political arena, and it's sort of like, you're at a county fair, those little shooting galleries, and you have all these cross-moving targets. I mean, that's what's happening today. The enemy has sort of overplayed its hand, And while they're doing things like this in New York City, teaching the kids, going after the individual with white privilege, white supremacy, white this, white that, burning and looting, they've kind of taken their eye off the Confederacy for a while. It's still there, but this is an opportunity for that survival mode, to regroup. Because now their target is much wider. So they went from the Confederacy to the U.S. founding, from Lee to General Washington, and now to all of us individually. I mean, this is serious stuff. If you knew what was going on in the universities, I mean, it's amazing. Just absolutely amazing. It is the worst form of indoctrination I have ever read about, and it is very effective.
What about critical race theory?
That's just a communistic front to overthrow our economic system and to divide and conquer. I can talk about that, but it's all about, let's imagine all this stuff about, I'm going to digress for a minute. Let's imagine that the people promoting critical race, it started as a legal theory, that the courts were biased. And then it spread out to everybody's biased. So it really started in English departments. Think of St. John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word. Words are important. Communication is important. And so English departments, and Mel Bradford wrote about this extensively, deconstructed the language, where language has no inherent meaning. It's up to the reader to interpret subjectively, not objective meaning. And you could see, okay, so words don't mean anything, neither does gender. If this author didn't mean that, but only what I think he or she meant, or what feels good to me, you can apply that to nature. You see what I'm saying? So you have all these different genders because there's no objectivity. Math doesn't even mean, in Seattle, they're teaching math can be subjective. I mean, we're really in trouble. But critical race theory is essentially, it has two different prongs. One of them is to, this is not hyperbole, but it's the enemy within. It's asymmetrical warfare. They're destroying us from within, not from outside. It started in Italy. It started with with Gramsci and others. In other words, take over the universities, change America's corrupt education. Wow, it's a long.
Told us they're going to do this to us.
Pardon me?
Nikita Khrushchev came here and told us.
Yeah, but we were thinking, kinetic warfare, and he's thinking, no, we're going to undermine your culture and civilization from within. And that's what they're doing. It's the Trojan horse.
Yes.
The enemy is here. The enemy is winning. We are losing, and most Americans are asleep.
Yes.
But the critical race theory, it has two prongs. A destruction of our society, of Christendom, Western civilization, no question about that in my mind, and reparations. Reparations. And if you look at the government reports, for example, the Congressional Budget Office, how much reparations are going to cost? Up to $26 trillion. And who's going to make the money? Not only the descendants of slaves, attorneys, real estate, it's a boondoggle. So, in other words, it's plunder. So one is plunder. Bastiat talks, financial plunder. He also talks about philanthropic. People that are motivated by thinking they're doing the right thing. And most of these people, some of them, are not concerned with making money. They're concerned because they don't have religion, they don't have a soul. They're looking for some reason, purpose to live. And that is to be a revolutionary and create a so-called utopia on earth, a heaven on earth. So Now, going back to the Confederacy, believe it or not, the Confederate framers understood this. The Confederacy, the United States started to come apart prior to 1860. They were coming apart denominationally from the 1840s, 1850s. Even Masonic lodges were splitting because the New Englanders, the intellectuals, for the first, this is, from what I can gather, the most significant reason when it comes to Protestant denominations, were denying the divinity of Christ. You deny the divinity of Christ, and your civilization's gone as it was intended. In other words, if St. Paul says, if Christ didn't rise from the dead, our faith is useless. And so, you know, we're being hit on all sides, all fronts. And the Confederate framers understood this, and they didn't want to secede. If you read the Congressional Globe in the late antebellum period, they thought about this. Not all, some were firebrands, but some, agonized over this. And they thought about a later reunification if the North would correct its ways. When I say the principles of 1776 were defeated, the Southerners, it was a reactionary effort to recover the principles of 1776. And of course, what about slavery? I'm not going to get into that. But it was to recover the principles of 1776. I will say this, contrary to the narrative, the Confederacy did not mandate slavery. They left it where the U.S. Constitution left it. It was a states' rights issue. And I am convinced that slavery would have been ended within a few short years within the Confederacy, or the present state I'm in would have been the last holdout, and there's a reason for that, demographics and other things. But slavery would have been ended. You tell me, in the Confederacy, Native Americans were given a territory that's now called Oklahoma. Native Americans, Indians, were given representation in the Confederate Congress. Native Americans in what we now call Oklahoma were preparing to become a state within the Confederacy. Is that racist? But once again, if you want to be racist, that's your business. It's not mine. If the government doesn't treat people equally, then it becomes our business. And the government today is not treating people equally. It is not treating white male Christians equally. De facto and de jure. And what are we going to do about it? That's a problem. And it's a problem of centralization, power. I had a student, he asked, this is a freshman class, and man, talk about, well, it's a freshman class. And I'm teaching summer school. And we were discussing some things. You know, I have over 120 students in the class. And he said, what are we going to do about it? I said, that's not my concern, that's yours. We were talking about the national debt and things like that, and the Congress. And he pressed me. He said, well, what are you going to do about it? What can we do about it? And I said, well, this is just my opinion. And this is all, it's on Zoom, it's recorded, it's in the public domain. I said, you have to cut off the head of the snake. And he said, what does that mean? I said, the problem's the power, the centralization of power. As long as you have power, you're going to have psychopaths and sociopaths oriented towards that power to use it to oppress people. You have to put power back to where it belongs, in the people, in the small community. You're not going to get any solutions from the Republican Party, from the Democratic Party, from the Supreme Court. I wrote that in that book. Where's that Don Livingston? He said, "You're hard on the Supreme Court." Remember this? I said, "You'll see." You're not going to get it. You have to decentralize. How do you do it? There are ways to doing it. But the Confederacy, that's what they did. But that was also their Achilles heel. They were fighting a two-front war against the United States and against their own states. But that's how it's supposed to be. If you're free, you're going to have problems. And so the Confederacy started to centralize power. The states responded and started to take it back. A couple of states within the Confederacy during the war were talking about seceding from the Confederacy. So these are, I know we're getting up to lunch here, and I'll open it up to some Q&A, but let me just go back to a couple points. Consider the two following categories. The North, the Union, believed that the Declaration's fundamental rights of life, liberty, and property, and when we talk about pursuit of happiness, we're talking about property. And as James Madison pointed out in his essay on property, your property extends over your ideas and all sorts of things. It's you as an autonomous individual. And he warned us in that essay on property, if they can mess with your property, they're going to mess with your liberty. And if they can mess with your liberty, they're going to mess with your life, i.e., they can kill you. Because that's the ultimate power of the government. So, for example, you say, I own my home. You don't own your home. The government owns it. Try not paying taxes on it. And resist to the end. We don't own anything. And that goes back to what is a slave? If slavery means somebody owns your labor, we are all slaves, at least 50% slave. Because we pay at least 50% of our income to the government without our consent. I'm talking about informed consent. So let me get back to this. If the Union believed the Declaration's fundamental rights of life, liberty, and property are foundational to the American political order, but rejected the right of secession and government being based upon the consent of the governed. You can't have it both ways. You can't say you're committed to the Declaration of Independence and opposed to state secession, because the Revolution was all about secession from the British Empire. And if you look at the last paragraph of the Declaration, and this was an international law at the time, a state is a nation. When they use the word state, they're meaning nation. The nation of Virginia, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, they were nations. And as St. George Tucker pointed out, you cannot implicitly give up your sovereignty as a nation. It has to be explicit as ascension into another country or by conquest. So you can't have it both ways. The South, the Confederacy, believed in the Declaration's fundamental rights of life, liberty, and property, and that the Declaration's affirmation of the right of secession is a precondition of government based upon the consent of the governed. Texas v. White, 1869, where it says it's not constitutional, we've been sort of a mind control to believe everything the same Supreme Court issues in an opinion is accurate with the constitutional principles. But the right of secession is a precondition of the Declaration of Independence, commitment to life, liberty, and property, given to us not from government, but by, from the Creator. So going back to a constitution, we really don't need a constitution because we have these natural rights. The Constitution is just sort of firewalls to tell the government, stay out. You can do X, Y, and Z. Don't mess with A, B, and C. I don't want to get into that. That would take way too long. But suffice it to say, let me close up, conclude by saying that the Confederacy didn't have a chance to evolve. And using the example, the chef in the burning kitchen. We don't know for sure, but all indications are that the Confederacy would have been a much more just system of government in protecting fundamental rights than the U.S. Government was at the time and as it evolved. The Confederacy would have been a much more prosperous nation. William Seward knew this, and that's why he tried to buy off Jefferson Davis with the second transcontinental railroad on a southern route, and Davis said no. Very tempting. Most politicians, they go into government to do good, and within a few months they're there to do well, if you know what I mean. So, and that's the truth. Never forget that. That is the gospel truth. And if you're wondering why you can't figure out what's happening on the court and in Congress, and I've spoken with people who've been there and done that, bribery. They have dirt on them. It could be sexual, drugs, gambling, corruption, money under the table. Don't think you're going to get any solutions out of that, what Trump would call the swamp. No way. So when you think of what Seward's concern was, we talk about Lincoln and such. Seward was sort of the power behind the throne. They were building a great plundering machine to get wealthy, and they were draining the South. The South knew it and said enough is enough. And so they tried to bribe them off, come and, get a piece of the action. And they said no, because they were committed to something better. That's one place where we really had statesmen in American political history at a critical juncture. So that transcontinental railroad, when the Southern Confederate leaders said no, Seward, and you could read this in the Congressional Globe, he said, this must not stand because we're going to lose all the states up through the Mississippi Valley, probably Cuba, Mexico, Central. What's going to happen is a tremendous commercial empire of prosperity and freedom. However, that's decided in those other countries with a different cultural, political history. But it's all about plunder. And that's why the Confederate Constitution did not require slavery as a precondition of admission. You wanted to join, you'd go through the same process of admission as you did in the U.S. Constitution. You didn't have to have slaves. So, in closing, the Confederate Constitution, it's that sort of that neon sign flashing, government bad, government bad, government bad. There's no question about it. All government has a tendency towards oppression. The only way to stop that is through decentralization, and local governments could be just as bad as a national. And when we talk about national government, we're now in the transnational mode. The United States is in a position of South Carolina in 1860. We're talking about global governance, hyper-centralization. The local governments can be just as bad and just as tyrannical. The main difference, we're armed and we know where they live. And that's the truth. All right, thanks, folks. I know it's lunchtime, so thank you for your attention.